Now we're going to look at changes in punishments and how it changed over time. So to begin with, we'll have a look at the Bloody Code, or otherwise known as the Waltham Black Act. The purpose behind this being, it was a harsh punishment, hanging, for crimes, even relatively minor crimes. The idea behind it being, if we make minor crimes punishable by death, then nobody will commit crimes. The context behind this is that towns were growing, and whilst not at cities yet, towns were beginning to grow, and authorities needed to try and find a way to tackle the growing crime rate. It failed. The Waltham Black Act of 1723 increased the number of deaths punishable by death. By 1821, around 221 separate offences were punishable by death, including blackening the face with charcoal, because it was decided that, the reason you would do this was because you were about to commit a crime. So even at this point, if you were found guilty of intending to commit a crime, you could be hanged for it, in theory, by law. The purpose, as I've said, is to deter criminals from committing crimes. Theoretically, a good idea, but crime continued, because when the Bloody Code was put into operation, juries refused to find people guilty of minor crimes when they knew death penalty would be the punishment. Largely because the reason people are committing these crimes was in order to survive. Therefore, juries often sympathised with the criminal, perhaps they'd even been in the same situation themselves. So what a lot of juries would do would be to just find people not guilty. This was called pious perjury, as in sparing them the death penalty, but really you're lying. The reason being, again, people had developed more empathy and sympathy, a conscience towards criminals who were simply trying to survive. They're stealing or whatever in order to try and survive. This led to actually fewer people being hanged due to the development of a conscience. The Bloody Code did not tackle the root cause of crime and therefore failed. For example, if I need some bread in order to survive, as in I'm going to die if I don't have any, the fact that I get hanged for stealing the bread isn't going to stop me from stealing it, because I'm going to die anyway. Therefore, the Bloody Code was abolished in 1823 by Robert Peel. In summary, it was too harsh and it ended in 1823. One other reason why the Bloody Code ended was another punishment had been developing: transportation. It was deemed more humane, or a humane alternative to the Bloody Code. Why did we decide to transport criminals, as in send them to another country? Just to remind you here, at first we were sending criminals to America. However, in 1776 they won the American War of Independence, removing British rule from America, and after that we sent criminals to Australia. So why did we transport criminals in the first place? Well, one, for the government's point of view, it was free settlers and labourers for new colonies. It can generate wealth and source raw materials from the empire. We're going to send criminals over there to build the colonies for people to then inhabit and look for resources there. Britain's prisons weren't efficient. We started to get prisons, but they're not effective yet. So they're overcrowded, as well as the hulls. The hulls are full as well. They're not effective. The hulls are those ships that we've seen that were parked just off the coast. And Britain had just lost control of America, so they needed somewhere else to send criminals. The fear of the unknown was often enough to deter some people from committing crimes. However, it remains more lenient than the death penalty, so it's sort of that middle ground between being too harsh, like the Bloody Code, but also not an effective deterrent. It's in that little grey area between them. Downsides to transportation, where it's very expensive to transport people. One, you've got the actual cost of the journey, but then once in Australia, you'd have to have a garrison of soldiers there as guards to make sure nobody escaped. In addition to that, you get the discovery of gold in Australia, which means it becomes less of a deterrent to send people there, because you've got people actively wanting to go there, because as transportation continues, when we get towards the end of it, Australia's kind of developed and it's becoming a more desirable place to live. So why would we send criminals there? Families of people transported were left with no income to support themselves, which would lead to more crime. If the main breadwinner was transported, how do the women and children survive? Often through crime. In addition to that, whilst transportation was seen as less harsh than the Bloody Code or the death penalty, some people still saw it as unfair and unreasonably harsh. As well as that, there's the expense associated with it. Later on, as Australia developed, it didn't want undesirables. There was a growing belief in the country that it should be proud of its colonies, so wildly populate it with criminals. One famous example of transportation being used as a punishment was the Tolpuddle Martyrs, who were sent in 1833, and then it was sentenced to 7 years initially, but it was ended short and they were returned to England in 1836. Transportation was then ended in 1868, and we see a shift towards the use of prisons. Why? Well, we'd had prisons for a while, but they hadn't been effective. We see the work of the reformers. First of all, John Howard, often seen as the father of prison reform, devoted and spent his life visiting prisons in Europe, and eventually wrote a book called The State of Prisons. He advocated that prisoners should have meaningful work, as in teach them to do something worthwhile, and they'll be able to get a job once they're out of prison and they won't commit further crime. His ideas led to the government passing the Jails Act of 1774. Now, the important thing here is, whilst they passed the Jails Act saying that they should improve prisons, there's no inspections, so jailers don't enforce the beliefs of Howard and what the Jails Act says. This leads to a huge gap between legislation and implementation. Later on, you get Elizabeth Fry, who built on Howard's ideas. She was a Quaker, so she was influenced by her religious beliefs, and she was horrified by the conditions she witnessed when she visited prisons such as Newgate. She wanted basic rights for prisoners. The ideas of the reformers, Howard and Fry, were noticed by Home Secretary Robert Peel, and therefore government passed the Jails Act in 1823, which introduced inspections to prisons, reducing the gap between legislation and implementation. They also introduced paid jailers and basic education for prisoners, therefore again the idea of getting a job when you get out, and visits from chaplains and doctors, teach them about religion, teach them about how to be a good person, but also make sure they're healthy again. All these things to try and make people better people and rehabilitate them so they can get jobs once they leave prison and not just get returned to prison committing crimes. Victorian systems later on develop. You get the Pentonville prison, constructed in 1842. That's on the diagram there with the 5 wings off it. Separate system meant no human contact. This was designed to stop new prisoners being influenced by more experienced criminals. However, this often drove people mad and led to an increase in the suicide rate. And the silent system meant no communication between prisoners. Both of these policies, separate and silent system, were enforced by corporal punishment, as in beating people up, and meaningless work, as in work which is pointless, such as the treadmill, the loom, or the pick oakum, as in separating, unraveling rope. In the Victorian period, in the industrial period, prisons remain a compromise between deterrent through the form of retribution, but also the emerging idea of rehabilitation. So whilst they're starting to introduce the idea of rehabilitation, they don't get all the way there. There's still a lot of retribution involved. Okay. The reason why these punishments change is because we have changing social attitudes over time. You can clearly see from the graph there and how the punishments have changed and how regularly they are used, the changing social attitudes. People developing a conscience and decided killing people or sending them to hard labour was inhumane. Okay, and then obviously that developed further in the 20th century with the punishments that we see there and the alternative punishments, which will be covered on the 20th century slide or video.